So picture this. It's 1967, and the most celebrated pop music genius in America, a guy who was literally reshaping how we understand sound, decides he needs to build a massive wooden sandbox right in the middle of his Beverly Hills living room.
Right, like an actual sandbox.
An actual sandbox. He fills it with, I think it was like 8 tons of imported beach sand. Just dumps it in there. Then he drags his grand piano right into the center of it, and he sits there, trying to feel the literal earth under his bare feet while he's composing.
It's just such a wild visual.
It really is. But the crazy part is, not long after that, he basically just stops getting out of bed. He was working on this project, right? Something he called a teenage symphony to God. And industry insiders were saying this album was going to completely obliterate what the Beatles had just done.
Yeah, everyone was waiting for it.
But then he shows it. He literally walks away from it. He locks the tapes in a vault. And it becomes probably the most famous ghost album in the entire history of music.
Without a doubt. It's the great paradox of 20th century American culture, really. You have this towering figure, Brian Wilson, and the music of the Beach Boys. And for decades, that music has basically functioned as this glossy, impenetrable armor of American optimism.
Oh, totally. It's a soundtrack of the endless summer.
Exactly. But when you strip away the striped shirts and the surfboards, what you actually find is a man who is essentially using pop melodies to build this fortress around his own fracturing psyche.
Yeah, which is just fascinating. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to figure out how a band that millions of people strictly associate with, hot rods and transistor radios and these endless July afternoons, how they actually created this profound, almost unbearably intimate map of melancholy and fragile joy.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
It really is. And to do this, we have 2 very specific, very fascinating sources that we're using today. The first one is this incredibly rich literary piece of writing from a Substack publication called Chesterton Radio.
Yeah, they broadcast out of this little town on the Missouri River, right?
Atchison, Kansas, yeah. And their whole ethos is examining modern life and art through these timeless spiritual and philosophical themes. Specifically, they use the worldview of the early 20th century philosopher G.K. Chesterton. So their essay is called God Only Knows, Brian Wilson, Fragile Joy, and the Harmony Beneath America.
Which is just such a rich text to work from. Because, they aren't just doing a standard album review here. They treat Wilson's music as a lens to look at how we experience reality, how we deal with the inevitable arrival of sorrow, and how modern celebrity culture completely fails people who lack emotional calluses.
Right, they have no armor. And to anchor that philosophical text, our second source is the raw, unedited transcript of a live concert. But not just a regular concert. This is from decades later when an aging, visibly wounded Brian Wilson finally returned to the stage to perform that abandoned masterpiece. Yes, Smiley, live in its entirety. And it is a document that is just chaotic and bizarrely funny sometimes and just intensely moving. We're going to look at the mechanics of this music, the rivalry that drove it, and why true, lasting joy requires the courage to basically stare directly into the darkness.
Well, to really get to the bottom of this, we kind of have to start by dismantling the myth itself. The Chesterton Radio essay starts off by examining the sheer weight of what the Beach Boys represent to the subconscious memory of America.
Yeah, it's heavy.
It is, because it isn't just about a season, right? It's a mythology of perpetual forward motion, the post-war boom, all of that.
I think mythology is exactly the right word for it. The essayist shares this really vivid memory that I think paints the picture perfectly. He talks about being up late at night in the quiet of his house, and he's sitting with his youngest daughter who she couldn't sleep. And to pass the time, they start watching these grainy black and white videos of the Beach Boys on YouTube. He points to this specific lost concert film from 1964. And if you picture 1964 America, we are right on the precipice of some massive cultural upheaval. But in this video, the band looks impossibly, almost aggressively innocent.
Yeah, they're wearing those incredibly tight, narrow striped shirts and the short, high-waisted performance trousers. There's just this total absence of the cynicism that would completely define rock music just, a few years later.
Total absence. And the author notes this specific moment where Mike Love is singing the song Little Bird. And the lyric is, "If she had a set of wings, then I know she could fly." And as he's singing it, he is literally standing on stage, flapping his arms like a child doing a chicken dance.
Wow.
Right. And the author and his daughter are just sitting there in the dark, laughing out loud at him. Because it is so radically earnest, there's no protective layer of irony at all. It's just surface level, pure sunshine.
But see, the brilliance of this essay is how it immediately complicates that sunshine. Because to millions of people, that bright, major-key optimism wasn't just entertainment, it was an emotional promise.
An emotional promise. I like that.
Yeah, it was the idea that the economic boom, the new highways, the suburban expansion, that all of it meant happiness could be engineered to last forever. You buy the right car, you catch the right wave, and the summer literally never ends.
But the author's daughter actually provided a reality check on that, didn't she? There's this other story he tells that happens years later. He's walking along the River Walk in San Antonio with that same daughter, and the place is packed. Suddenly, she just stops, points across the crowd at this totally random, middle-aged guy, and screams at the top of her lungs, "Mom, he looks like the Beach Boys."
I love that detail so much. She didn't say, he looks like a member of the band.
No, not a Beach Boy. She said, he looks like the Beach Boys. Like he was this singular entity, a monolith.
And that gets right to the core of how children process archetypes, right? Kids intuitively grasp the shape of a myth long before they can actually articulate the details of it. She didn't recognize a specific human face. She recognized the emotional resonance of an era, the whole aesthetic of the unbothered American male.
Right, right.
But to recognize something as a myth is also to recognize on some deep subconscious level that it's a construct. It's only half of the story.
But wait, I have to push back here a little bit because I can hear a skeptical listener right now saying, look, it's 1963. These are teenagers from Hawthorne, California. They're writing songs called Surfin' USA and Fun, Fun, Fun. The lyrics are literally about taking your dad's Ford Thunderbird to a hamburger stand.
Sure.
So are we, as modern listeners, just projecting all this deep melancholy onto those early records because we know the tragic trajectory of Brian Wilson's life later on? I mean, was he really intentionally hiding sadness in these surf bops from day one?
Right.
Or is this just retrospective intellectualizing?
That is the essential question. Are we overreading the pop music? And to answer that, we actually can't look at the lyrics of those early songs. Because Brian wasn't primarily a lyricist back then. Mike Love and others were handling a lot of the car and surf imagery.
Okay, yeah.
We have to look at the musical mechanics. We have to look at how Brian Wilson's brain actually processed the sensory world. And this is where the essay introduces a phenomenal framework from G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah, I wanted to get into this.
So Chesterton observed that humanity is generally divided into two camps when it comes to perceiving reality. There are people who read words, and there are people who read realities.
Okay, reading realities sounds a bit mystical to me, like somebody holding a crystal to their forehead or something. What does that actually mean in practice? Because if I'm navigating through life, I kind of need to read the literal words on the map, not just vibe with the atmospheric pressure of the journey.
It does sound abstract until you contrast it with how we live today. Think about our current hyper-optimized world. We are a society built almost exclusively for people who read words.
What do you mean?
Well, we navigate via algorithms, data points, productivity metrics, literal definitions. If you want to find a partner, you swipe on a list of attributes. If you want to measure success, you look at a spreadsheet of return on investment. Everything is categorized, labeled, and placed in a semantic box.
Everything has to be quantifiable.
Precisely. But there's a totally different cognitive approach to the world. People who read realities navigate by atmosphere, emotional gravity, pattern recognition, and harmony.
Oh, I see.
They walk into a room, and before anyone speaks a single word, they feel the tension, the unspoken history, the emotional architecture of the space. They don't process life through intellectual categorization. They process it through sensory and emotional absorption.
And so you're saying Brian Wilson didn't just hear a C major chord and intellectually categorize it as happy. He felt the physical and emotional weight of it.
Exactly. He was a savant of emotional translation. He couldn't always articulate his feelings in a normal conversation, but if you put him in a studio, he could use a session bassist, a glockenspiel, and 3-part vocal harmony to perfectly recreate the exact feeling of being terrified of the future. The essay quotes a line suggesting his songs feel less like musical compositions and more like memories one somehow forgot having.
Wow, that's a beautiful way to put it.
That is what reading a reality sounds like.
To ground this, the author of the essay shares a story about his older daughter that completely stopped me in my tracks. It perfectly illustrates this idea of navigating the world without relying on literal text.
Yeah, this is a powerful part of the piece.
So this daughter is severely dyslexic. From a very early age, her brain was forced to bypass the ordinary, semantic way that we label the world. and she had to develop this incredibly heightened spatial and emotional intuition instead.
Right, the incident at the cemetery in Wisconsin.
Yes, exactly. The family goes up to St. Norbert's Abbey. And for context, the cemetery there is visually overwhelming. It is field after field of identical, stark, white wooden crosses. Hundreds of them, perfectly aligned.
No unique headstones, nothing.
Nothing. No distinguishing monuments.
Yeah.
Just a sea of geometric uniformity. The family is walking through this, looking for a specific grave. And before this young girl could properly read the names carved into the wood, she suddenly just breaks away from the group.
She just runs.
She runs ahead, completely bypassing rows and rows of identical crosses. She climbs up onto the crossbeam of one specific random white cross, wraps her arms around the wood, and shouts, "I found him!"
And it was the grave of her great-uncle.
Yes. Her great-uncle, who was a Norbertine priest, a man who baptized the author, married the author and his wife, and baptized this very little girl. Out of hundreds of identical markers, she ran straight to his. The author admits that even now, decades later, he cannot logically explain how she did it. She couldn't read the text. She didn't use a map.
She felt the gravity of the reality.
Exactly. She felt the truth of the space. She bypassed the intellectual requirement of reading the name and just responded to the emotional architecture of the moment.
And that, musically speaking, is Brian Wilson. When you ask if we are projecting melancholy onto his early music, you really have to look at the chord progressions he was sneaking into songs about surfing.
Right, the musical mechanics.
He was heavily influenced by jazz harmony, specifically vocal groups like the Four Freshmen. So underneath these bouncy 44 pop beats, he was using complex chord inversions, diminished sevenths, suspended chords that naturally create a sense of sonic tension and yearning. He was reading the reality of his own anxiety and layering it right under the socially acceptable words of teenage surf culture.
But if your brain is wired to feel the world that intensely, if you are just this raw, walking nerve ending, picking up the emotional frequency of everything around you, how long can you realistically keep writing songs about catching waves before that emotional dam just completely breaks? I mean, doesn't that make you dangerously exposed to the world?
It leaves you entirely without a shield. The intellectual categorization that most of us use, the reading words part of our brains, it acts as a filter. It protects us from feeling everything all at once. Wilson didn't have that filter. And the dam you mentioned breaking, that moment in history is the album Pet Sounds.
The pivot. This is where the endless summer officially ends. The essay has this beautiful, haunting description of Pet Sounds. It doesn't just call it a great album, it calls it the sound of sunlight discovering melancholy.
Oh, that's such a striking phrase.
Isn't it? It describes it as the precise moment that innocence becomes self-conscious.
Which is a tragic transition if you think about it, because the defining characteristic of true innocence is that it is totally unaware of itself.
Right.
The second you become self-conscious of your innocence, you realize it's fragile. You realize it is something that can be lost or corrupted or stolen. And that realization introduces fear.
Let's look at the mechanics of this, because I really want to understand how he made that fear sound so beautiful. Take the opening track, Wouldn't Be Nice. If you hear that playing in the background at a grocery store or on an oldies radio station, the melody just sparkles.
It sounds so happy.
It sounds like this triumphant major key celebration of young love. There are those bright chiming 12-string guitars, the driving snare drum, the soaring vocal harmonies. It sounds like joy.
But look at the mechanism of the song. Look at the reality he's actually building. The song doesn't start in the home key. It starts with this delicate, almost music box-like intro played on a detuned harp.
Yeah, it's very dreamy.
Which creates this slightly dizzy, dreamlike disorientation right before slamming into a totally different key for the verse. And linguistically, the song is entirely conditional.
Oh, wow. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older? Wouldn't it be nice if we could wake up in the morning?
Right. It is fundamentally built on yearning. It is not a celebration of something they currently possess. It is a desperate, agonizing prayer for something they lack.
That completely changes how you hear it.
It's a plea for stability, for the safety of adulthood, for permanence in a world that feels terrifyingly chaotic. The sparkling instrumentation isn't there to express joy. It's there to express the fantasy of joy.
It's like trying to build a structural support out of glass. It's incredibly beautiful to look at, but you know it's going to shatter if you put any real weight on it.
And this connects to a core Chestertonian philosophy that the essay weaves in so beautifully. Chesterton famously wrote that the world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder.
The world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder.
Exactly. We live in a universe packed with miraculous things, but we suffer from a sort of spiritual fatigue where we lose the capacity to be amazed by them. We get cynical, we get tired.
Yeah, that happens to everyone.
But Brian Wilson, with Pet Sounds, was waging a one-man war against that cynicism. He was desperately trying to preserve wonder before the harsh realities of adulthood and the music industry could crush it out of him. And he realized that joy isn't naive optimism. Naive optimism is just ignoring the dark. True joy is meaningful precisely because the darkness exists all around it, and you choose to strike a chord anyway.
So the studio basically became his sanctuary. If the real world was chaotic and full of pressure, he could go into Western recorders in Hollywood with the Wrecking Crew, these elite, hardened session musicians, and he could control everything.
He was the absolute master of that space.
You could tell the bass player to slide up an octave. He could bring in bicycle bells, empty water jugs, Coca-Cola bottles, electrotheremins. He was building a musical bunker to protect his fragile reality.
A cathedral of sound to keep the darkness out.
But the tragedy is that the bunker didn't hold. The walls collapsed. And this is where the story shifts from a triumphant artistic breakthrough into one of the most agonizing breakdowns in pop culture history. Why did the bunker fail? Why did the very thing he created to protect himself end up destroying him?
To understand the breakdown, you have to look at the cultural machinery of the 1960s music industry. Modern celebrity culture, especially as rock and roll really evolved in the late 60s, had absolutely no ecosystem to support a soul like Brian Wilson's. Think about the archetypes of rock stardom that were emerging then. You have Mick Jagger. You have Jim Morrison. What was the industry rewarding?
Swagger. Aggression, hypersexuality, invincibility, a whole bad boy mythos.
Exactly. It rewarded appetite and edge. Brian Wilson had no edge. He was fundamentally childlike. He was emotionally exposed, deeply insecure, and physically terrified of touring. He just wanted to stay in the studio and find the perfect chord while his record label, Capitol Records, was screaming at him for another surfing hit to compete with the Beatles.
The pressure must have been unbelievable.
It was. And the essay points out that Chesterton warned repeatedly about the dangers of a society that produces specialists in one area while completely starving them of their basic, holistic humanity.
And Wilson became a specialist in beauty.
A supreme specialist. He could conjure sounds that seemed to come directly from the divine, but to do that, he neglected the ordinary human protections that Chesterton argued are absolutely essential for survival.
Protections like what?
Routine, domestic peace, grounded community, a sense of proportion, the ability to just be a normal, flawed human being without the weight of a multi-million-dollar corporation resting on your daily output. He had no healthy boundaries. He was self-medicating heavily with psychedelics, trying to open his mind even further to these musical realities, which only accelerated his psychological fracturing.
And this unbearable pressure cooker is what leads directly to Smile. The project that was supposed to be his magnum opus, the follow-up to Pet Sounds, he called it a teenage symphony to God. And he brought in this eccentric lyricist, Van Dyke Parks, to help him write these dense, surreal, Americana-laced lyrics. But he just couldn't finish it. The perfectionism, the paranoia, the lack of support from his own bandmates who didn't understand the new direction, it all compounded until he literally walked away, leaving it as an unfinished cathedral.
He was a man crushed under the weight of his own emotional architecture. The tapes sat in a vault, heavily bootlegged, building this massive mythological status. For decades, Smile was considered the greatest album never released.
But in a twist that is genuinely miraculous, it doesn't end in the vault. Decades later, in 2004, an aging, incredibly fragile Brian Wilson did the unthinkable. He went back to the tapes, he finished the arrangements.
It's still hard to believe he did it.
And he took a massive band out on tour to perform Smile live, front to back. And we have this raw transcript from a YouTube video of one of those live performances. Reading through this transcript is a wild experience because you can see the sheer, unbridled chaos of his vision. It does not follow any standard rules of pop music.
It is a sprawling avant-garde collage. When you read the transcript, you realize he wasn't writing songs. He was composing modular, interlocking movements.
Let's dig into some of these specific movements, because the tonal whiplash is just incredible. At one moment, you have this sweeping Old West mythology of heroes and villains with these intricate barbershop quartet vocal arrangements singing, "I've been in this town so long, I fell in love years ago with an innocent girl from the Spanish night." It's cinematic.
Very cinematic.
And then a few minutes later, you are plunged into this chilling, atmospheric piece called Wind Chimes. The lyrics are, "Tingling, whispering wind, a tear rolls off my cheek. Though it's hard, I try not to look at my wind chimes." It's incredibly intimate, isolating, and drenched in sorrow.
And the musical arrangement on Wind Chimes matches that sorrow perfectly. It uses these sparse, chilling, percussive elements that make you feel like you were standing in a cold, empty house. But then, juxtaposed right up against that profound isolation, you have a track called Vegetables.
Oh man, Vegetables. This is where the transcript gets almost surreal. He is earnestly singing a health food anthem. "I'm going to chop down my vegetables. I love you most of all. My favorite vegetables." He literally has a lyric where he sings, "I tried to kick the ball, but my tennis shoe flew right off. I'm red as a beet because I'm so embarrassed."
It's so odd.
And the percussion track for this song originally involved Paul McCartney coming into the studio and literally chewing raw celery into a microphone.
It sounds absurd on paper, but when you listen to it in the context of the suite, it is treated with the exact same harmonic reverence as the deeply serious pieces, and that is the hallmark of someone who reads realities.
How so?
Well, a mind like Wilson's in that era didn't compartmentalize. The sweeping American history of heroes and villains, the terrifying emotional isolation of wind chimes, and the childlike silliness of losing your shoe in vegetables, they all exist on the exact same plane of existential importance to him. They are all necessary pieces of the human experience.
But I want to pose a hard question here about that live performance. Because for almost 40 years, Smiley was perfect precisely because it didn't exist. It was flawless in the imagination of music critics.
Right, it was this mythical holy grail.
But when Brian Wilson finally sat on that stage in 2004, he wasn't a pristine 24-year-old wunderkind anymore. His voice was heavily weathered. He physically looked stiff and uncomfortable, sitting rigidly behind the keyboard, essentially reading the lyrics off a teleprompter. He looked like a man who had barely survived a 40-year war with his own mind. So by finishing it in that compromised, fragile state, did he actually ruin the myth of the perfect album? Did he pull the curtain back too far?
The Chesterton Radio essay vehemently argues against that perspective, and it uses a deeply Chestertonian principle to do so. Our modern culture has a toxic obsession with perfection. We want the flawless, auto-tuned, hyper-edited, optimized version of everything. We want our heroes to be untouchable gods.
Yeah, we really do.
But Chesterton understood something far deeper, that completion is almost always more beautiful than perfection.
Completion over perfection. Explain the difference there.
Perfection is a sterile, inhuman standard. It requires an absence of flaws. Completion, on the other hand, is the act of a flawed human being pushing through their limitations to bring something into the light. The live performance of Smiley wasn't a miracle because it was sonically flawless. It was a miracle because Brian Wilson survived long enough to sing it.
Wow, that's heavy.
When you watch that footage or read the transcript of the finale when the band hits the unimaginably complex vocal counterpoints of good vibrations, the music fundamentally shifts its meaning. It stops being this triumphant, untouchable monument to a young prodigy's massive ego. Instead, it becomes something profoundly merciful.
Merciful?
Because he's letting us see the scars. Yes. It's the sound of an older man who is nearly destroyed by his own genius, standing on stage surrounded by a younger generation of musicians who are essentially holding him up. And he is finally making peace with his own limitations. The intricate harmonies are still there, but they are now heavily anchored by visible, undeniable human fragility. He is no longer a mythological golden god of the 1960s. He is a wounded, vulnerable human being offering the audience whatever he has left to give. And that vulnerability makes the music infinitely more powerful than perfection ever could.
And this shift from striving for this untouchable defensive perfection to fully acknowledging your own deep human limitation is perfectly encapsulated in what is arguably the emotional centerpiece of his entire legacy.
Oh, absolutely.
The song that Paul McCartney famously cited as the greatest pop song ever written.
We have to talk about God Only Knows.
Absolutely. God Only Knows from the Pet Sounds album. The essay spends significant time on this track because it feels almost unbearably sincere, especially when you drop it into our incredibly cynical, irony-soaked modern age.
The orchestration alone is just a marvel. If you look at the musical influences, he is pulling from Bach's counterpoint, the jazz harmonies we mentioned earlier, and Phil Spector's wall of sound. But he is stripping away Spector's aggression and replacing it with pure tenderness.
Yeah, it's so gentle compared to Spector.
He uses a French horn, sleigh bells, a harpsichord, and a string section to create a sound that feels almost liturgical. Like you said earlier, it sounds like a hymn.
It really does. But what strikes me the most is the lyricism, which was co-written by a guy named Tony Asher. Think about modern pop culture, which constantly trains us to perform total self-sufficiency. Every pop anthem today is about being independent, unbothered, and entirely capable of standing alone.
Right, showing that you desperately need someone is culturally coded as a weakness now.
Exactly. But look at the very first line of God Only Knows. It is one of the most revolutionary opening lines in pop history.
I may not always love you.
It's a shocking way to open a love song. Because instead of making a grandiose, impossible promise of eternal perfection, it immediately acknowledges human failing and the unpredictability of time.
It grounds the song in reality.
It does, but then it pivots to the chorus. God only knows what I'd be without you.
It is the ultimate anti-mic drop. Instead of strutting off the stage, pounding his chest about how invincible his love is, he's essentially handing the microphone to the listener while his hands are visibly shaking. He is admitting out loud, I cannot do this life alone. I am not self-sufficient, and the thought of existing without you is terrifying.
And who did he choose to sing that terrifyingly vulnerable lead vocal? He didn't sing it himself.
No, he gave it to his younger brother, Carl Wilson. Carl had this angelic, pure, incredibly tender voice. Brian knew that to deliver a lyric about absolute dependence, he needed the vocal to sound pure, humble, and completely devoid of ego.
Which is such a brilliant producer move.
It is, and this brings us right back to Chesterton's philosophy. Chesterton wrote extensively about the idea that love is fundamentally a state of gratitude.
Gratitude for what?
Gratitude for the fact that you do not have to exist in a void. Gratitude that someone else is willing to help you carry the weight of reality. God Only Knows feels like a hymn because it is a raw, unvarnished confession of dependence. It is defying the modern illusion that we can or should survive entirely on our own.
And that realization that true art and maybe true humanity requires us to strip away the armor, admit our terrifying vulnerabilities, and actually share them with each other. That is how beauty survives across generations.
It doesn't survive as a perfect, untouchable artifact in a museum under glass.
No, it survives by passing from one fragile human being to another.
Which brings the essay full circle, back to the author's daughter in Kansas. The one who as a child intuitively recognized the Beach Boys mythology and who possessed that heightened ability to read the reality of the cemetery.
Yeah, the essay catches up with her years later as a teenager. She is now dancing at the Raven School of Dance in Atchison. And despite her obvious talent and emotional depth, the author notes that for years she deeply doubted her own worth.
She struggled with it.
She would look around the studio at the other dancers' girls who practically lived there, whose entire identities were consumed by the aggressive competition of the dance world. And she felt she lacked their certainty. She didn't have their unshakable performative confidence.
She was experiencing the exact same imposter syndrome, that exact same vulnerability that comes when you perceive the world very deeply, but you lack the loud, aggressive armor that society usually rewards. She was a reader of reality surrounded by people who are very good at shouting the words.
But then there is this incredibly pivotal moment that the author witnesses. She has a solo performance in the studio, and she dances it with such raw, unfiltered emotional honesty that it actually moves her choreographer, a hardened professional named Ricky, to literal tears in front of the entire elite dance team.
Wow. And the essay zeroes in on why it moved him. It wasn't because her physical technique was the most flashy in the room. It wasn't because she projected an invincible, aggressive confidence.
It was because she allowed something truthful to emerge. In that moment, she stopped performing the idea of a confident dancer, and she just became the emotion of the piece. She let the vulnerability show.
She let the armor drop.
Exactly. And through that act of courage, she made a monumental internal transition. She stopped asking herself the paralyzing question, am I good enough? And started asking, how can I help others discover this beauty too?
She begins choreographing. She starts teaching the younger children at the studio. She takes the beauty that she fought so hard to understand, and she passes it forward to the next generation.
And the author shares a short poem that this daughter wrote titled Fireworks, which I think ties this entire deep dive together. It's a simple poem, but the emotional intelligence behind it is staggering.
What does the poem say?
She describes watching fireworks, how the colors, the light, the music, and the movement all form this perfect symphony in the sky for just a fleeting, miraculous moment. And then the smoke clears, the silence rushes back in, and the darkness quietly returns.
Oh, that's beautiful. And as the author is reading this poem, he realizes that his daughter has just perfectly described the exact emotional architecture of a Brian Wilson harmony.
That is exactly it. The harmonies rise, the French horns swell, the world feels unified and radiant and perfectly safe for one impossible, soaring moment. And then the chord fades. The silence and the darkness return around the edges. Because joy in this life is not permanent.
But the beauty mattered anyway. That is the central thesis of the essay, of the music, and of this entire conversation. The beauty mattered anyway. Chesterton has this wonderful, whimsical idea that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. They aren't weighed down by ego or the demand for perfection.
But Brian Wilson was an angel.
No, he sounded like a mortal man struggling under an enormous crushing weight, the weight of mental illness, of industry exploitation, and of his own raw emotional exposure. He was a man desperately trying to remember how to fly.
And against all odds, for a few luminous moments in the recording studio in 1966 and again on a stage in 2004, he succeeded. He found the harmony. And in doing so, he lifted millions of us up into the light with him.
So if we look back at the expansive journey we've taken today, we started with the sunny, unbothered myth of the Beach Boys, the illusion of the endless American summer.
We ventured down into the agonizing vulnerability of Brian Wilson's creative process, the collapse of his ambitions under the weight of the world, and the miraculous, merciful completion of Smiley decades later.
And we arrive at this profound Chestertonian realization that joy isn't the absence of sorrow. It isn't aggressively ignoring the dark clouds on the horizon. Joy is the courage to keep singing your part of the harmony, even when you know the silence is eventually coming back.
It's the courage of absolute dependence, admitting that God only knows what I'd be without you. And it's the courage to take the beauty you've managed to find and pass it forward to the next fragile human being, just like the dancer in Atchison.
It really comes down to the sacramental power of these ordinary things, doesn't it?
It does. And I want to leave you with a final thought today, inspired by the postscript of that Chesterton Radio broadcast. The essay concludes by arguing that human civilization, despite what the history books tell us, is not actually held together by the massive things.
Right. It's not held together by scale or technological optimization or political power or relentless innovation.
No. It is held together by shockingly fragile things.
A song sung late at night to a child who can't sleep. A teacher quietly encouraging a frightened student who doubts her own worth. A shared laugh over a grainy black and white video. A poem written by a teenager trying to make sense of the dark.
Look at your own life today. Your busy, schedule-driven, hyper-optimized life. Look past the metrics, the algorithms, and the tasks. What is the seemingly fragile, impractical, deeply beautiful thing that is secretly holding your world together right now? What is the harmony beneath the noise? And more importantly, what are you doing to protect it?
That is a profound question to carry with you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking for the realities behind the words, and we will catch you next time.